We're going to get started now. Certainly feel free to get up, get your coffee, do whatever, but we're going to get to maximize our time. Julia, maybe be the keeper or the passing around the microphone. If I could have your attention again, please. As I indicated, this is an opportunity for the participants of this Elder Hostel to pose any questions you might have of the participants who were part of that panel discussion earlier today. We had George Niebank, Donald Cronson, E. Barrett Prettyman, and we're, on behalf of the Robert Jackson Center, thrilled that they gave us their insights on Justice Jackson. It sort of helped fill out the mosaic for us at the Jackson Center, and we're also pleased that so many of you came to enjoy and to observe all that happened. And the moderator, as you know, is Professor John Barrett. Professor Barrett, the editor of That Man, which there are, I think, a couple copies lying around here. But there was a question asked earlier by one of the participants, or one of the folks in the crowd, to help put into historical perspective who some of the other justices were during the time period. And so I asked Professor Barrett if maybe he could just give us a little bit of an overview, and then I will be out in the audience to help maybe add some verbalization to some of the questions that you folks may have. John?
Thank you all very much for your interest this morning. Just to set the time period again and the scene at the Supreme Court of the United States, these gentlemen were law clerks with Justice Jackson from 1950 through 1954. Okay, don't fiddle with that. 1950 through 1954, and during that time period, the other 8 members of the Supreme Court were Chief Justice Fred Vinson, appointed by President Truman in 1946, and Associate Justices Hugo Black, William Douglas, Stanley Reed, Felix Frankfurter, all of whom had been appointed by President Roosevelt, Jackson, and then 3 Truman appointees, Tom Clark, Harold Burton, and Sherman Minton. In 1953, Chief Justice Vinson passed away suddenly, and President Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren, the governor of California, to succeed Vinson as Chief Justice. So this largely was the Vinson court, and then the first year of the Warren court that we were talking about this morning.
John, a question here?
When Justice Jackson spoke at Chautauqua in 1947, reading from the report from the Jamestown Post-Journal, there are several comments he made that I'd like the folks to respond to, pointing out that there were many who were afraid that if the trials, Nuremberg, were held, it would set a precedent whereby in 20 or 30 years, possibly American government leaders might face the same charges. He declared that if any Americans plot an aggressive war in the future, they should be under the law, which he termed a double-edged sword. Also, later in his address, he said, "We must not forget that the process which tries to overthrow your liberties is a subtle thing and is never announced as such. It is under the guise of protecting you." Could we have the law clerks respond to how Justice Jackson would view what is happening with our war of aggression in Iraq and our Patriot Act today?
That was a very eloquent question. Just to very briefly summarize it, the question is, what would be Jackson's perspective as the Nuremberg prosecutor and the proponent of the theory that aggressive war is an international crime? what would be Jackson's perspective on current United States military policy, including the war in Iraq.
I'm prepared to repeat what I've said to many people on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean the last 2 months. All right, can I help you here? This is not the first time I've been asked a similar question, and I will repeat what I've said on several occasions in the past, and then run for the door if necessary. But I think that if Justice Jackson were here right now, he would say that President Bush is a war criminal.
I honestly have no idea whether Justice Jackson would regard the preemptive strike as a justified protection of our liberties, or whether he would regard it as precisely the kind of situation he was referring to in his talk. I honestly don't know. He was a very, as I indicated this morning, a very practical man, and would not just follow a philosophy. He would work it out, I'm sure, in his own mind as to what the true situation was.
My view is a good deal different from Don Bronson's. Justice Jackson, of course I don't know, this is based on my knowledge of the man and appreciation for his viewpoint on things, I think he would distinguish between the preemptive strike in Iraq and the rising up against the Nazis, or taking on the Nazis. I can see him saying if we had had a preemptive strike 10 or 15 years earlier in Germany, there would never have been no World War III as we know it. So I don't think he would be. I don't think he would say that George Bush a war criminal at all.
Let me field the next question, but add a quip, which this is called to mind. I also obviously have no idea what Jackson would say, but what he did say, he was at Nuremberg as the war ended in the Pacific Theater, and the administration, through an emissary from President Truman and Secretary of State Burns, inquired whether Jackson would assume responsibility for prosecuting the war criminals in the Pacific Theater. And Jackson, who was AWOL from the Supreme Court and none too popular with his brethren for that, had a quip, which I don't take literally, but he meant it with humor. He said, "Not unless I get jurisdiction to prosecute MacArthur."
What do the gentlemen who are here believe was there special about Justice Jackson that had him appointed as the prosecutor for the Nuremberg trial?
The question is, what was special about Jackson that led him to be appointed as the Nuremberg prosecutor?
It was well known that Justice Jackson had a great deal of trial experience. It was also his record as a Solicitor General arguing cases before the court certainly made him, in my judgment, the most qualified around to do what he was selected to do.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I think the president also wanted someone who was not only eminently qualified, but who had a sterling reputation, somebody that everybody had heard of, who had a position that was unchallenged in terms of its importance, and to get that combination of abilities and reputation was something that was very important in order to make these trials both be lawful and appear lawful. For those of you who have not read Justice Jackson's opening and closing arguments at Nuremberg, I beg
what has been said by my two colleagues, I'll just add one other footnote, and that is, according to Bill's book, That Man, Roosevelt had already contemplated that Jackson would be the man to be used in Nuremberg, and that, of course, was a strong influence on Truman.
Next question, sir.
Given Justice Jackson's vital role at the Nuremberg trial, would you speculate what his position might be on the establishing of the International Criminal Court, which the Bush administration seems determined to undermine?
Given Jackson's Nuremberg work, what would be his position regarding the International Criminal Court established last summer by international treaty process but opposed by the United States?
I'm just unable to speculate on what his position would be on that.
I feel exactly the same way. I can think of him as a jurist saying, well, heaven, yes. But he also lived in the political world. And the notion of the international military tribunal might not, he would conclude, will not apply in the political world in which we live and live. And I think he would be concerned that the mere establishment of that court and the fact that it was sitting would be an invitation to trials that might not otherwise occur and that might not be really called for.
John, can you follow up on that? 2 years ago, you moderated a roundtable with 4 Nuremberg prosecutors who were with Justice Jackson, and I think it's safe to say 2 of them felt very strongly in one direction, 1 certainly strongly in the other direction. You just want to put that into perspective as to what their positions are?
Right. There is obviously a spectrum of very reasonable positions on the current International Criminal Court, including among the veterans of Nuremberg who are still with us. They were all young lawyers on Jackson's staff. 2 of them have been very active since 1998, which is when the treaty was drafted in Rome, in a committee that they were responsible for creating, former Nuremberg prosecutors for the International Criminal Court, Whitney Harris and Henry King. A third of the Nuremberg veterans who was here with us in October 2001, Bernard Meltzer, who's a law professor at the University of Chicago, has declined to be part of that enterprise and is a skeptic about the International Criminal Court. The 4th Nuremberg prosecutor here, who was here, James Conway, also hasn't participated on that issue particularly. He's not quite the opponent that Bernie Meltzer is, but Conway's perspective, which I found quite striking, was that Nuremberg responded to the reality of 1945, that the Nuremberg model obviously has a precedent concept and could develop potentially, but what it really was an approach to a particular problem. There was no Germany. There was no Europe. There was no alternative other than summary execution processes, which some of our allies were advocating. And so the Nuremberg project stepped into that gap, and some of the critics say that today's world doesn't have anything that approximates that gap. So there's a real spectrum, even among the Nuremberg participants. Sir.
Could one of you or more outline to us briefly the change in status of international law from pre-Nuremberg to post-Nuremberg and Jackson's direct influence?
How did international law change pre-Nuremberg to post-Nuremberg, and what was Jackson's influence or role in that evolution?
Jackson himself took the position in his famous opening and closing statements that all that he was doing was applying international law as already established by things like the Kellogg-Briand Pact and other international suspect, however, that the mere fact that we have the actual execution of the Durham Court process certainly adds greatly to any pre-existing international law on the subject, and will certainly be one of the factors that will be important in connection with the resolution of international legal problems presenting in similar situations.
Bearing in mind your admonition, to be sure, I believe that you can fairly say that the Nuremberg trial, the treaty, and the judgment did establish a form of precedent which had not been established before. I'm not going to review because I don't know all. Many people have been critical of parts of that. But in my view, that's what happened. Now, what role did he have? He obviously had a dominant role. But if you ask, is he the only one who could have done it? I can't answer that.
Further question? Sir, yes.
Comment was made at the panel that at best the Supreme Court now has 4 people who would have the ability to write, and the other 7 may not even make law clerk. I wouldn't want to identify that. That would be wrong or look fun. But more importantly, how do you think we got there, where the Frankfurters and the Jacksons and the Holmes and all the great justices were in days gone by, and the statesmanship of the Supreme Court has lost that stature? How do we get to where we are now?
The question asks about the change from Supreme Court justices of a type Jackson embodies, Frankfurter embodied, to what you're describing as a different type, a less hands-on writing of the opinions type, I guess, and how we made that move.
Well, I don't think you should assume that the justices serving today have their clerks all do first drafts or much of the work for them. It varies tremendously today, I'm told, almost as much as it did then, because there were some on the court in Jackson's time who allowed their clerks to do a good deal of work. And in fact, Rehnquist wrote an article, law review article, in which he found fault with the amount of the number of duties that law clerks were given and the amount of influence that he thought they had. There was a good deal of dispute about that article at the time, because the fact was, as we talked about this morning, that some justices used them very little, and Justice Douglas, for example, was one who used his clerk very, very little, and then those who used them a great deal. And I have the impression that today's court is not very different, that there are some of both varieties. I would agree with Barrett's views.
Yes, I do too, and I think that with your view of technical capability of lawyers, the present court has more of them than the court did at the time Jackson was there.
There's a, ma'am, question?
Could the law clerks or perhaps the grandson tell us something of his wife? So we know a little bit about his wife.
Question is about Mrs. Jackson? I can tell you her biography, and then I'll turn it over to them.
Personal anecdotes that would give us a further view of Jackson himself.
Sure. Robert Jackson married a woman named Irene Gerhardt, who was a native of Kingston, New York, outside Albany. He met her when he was a law student in Albany. His law school classmate was her cousin, and they were fixed up for an ice skating date. She was working as a secretary in the state government, and they met approximately 1912. They married in 1916, and they were married until Jackson's death in 1954. That's the basic outline on her. Memories or anecdotes about Mrs. Jackson?
Joe, would you fill it out a little bit for our children?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, of course. They had two children, a son, William, and a daughter, Mary. Both are now deceased. William Jackson became a lawyer and practiced law first as his father's executive assistant at Nuremberg. Pretty good first lawyer job as cases go. And then in New York City, where he rose to be the managing partner of major multinational law firm Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy, and really was a top lawyer. His clients, his personal clients, included Nelson Rockefeller, Jacqueline Onassis, the Shah of Iran, and so forth. Justice Jackson and Irene Jackson also had a daughter, Mary. Her children are, two of her three children are right here in front of me, Tom Loftus and Julia Craighill. Mary lived in Washington, D.C. She was very much her father's spirit in terms of the outdoors, a love of horses, camping, spirited sense of humor. In her adult years, in addition to being a mother of three children, she was very involved in dance and ran a dance company and theater. That may be the right word. I'm not a dance person, so I apologize if that's wrong. And that's the basic family outline. Bill and his wife had 5 children. Mary was the mother of 3 children. So that's the family. To the law clerks for any memories or anecdotes?
I remember her as a very gracious lady, but we didn't see a great deal of her. Talking about an anecdote, I don't know whether this qualifies, but I was always intrigued by the fact that she became a very close friend of the aviatrix Jacqueline Cochran. And how that started and what it did, I don't know, but it probably fascinating. I'm sorry to say that I did not know Mrs. Jackson very well. I had the impression of a grand lady who was quite shy and rather quiet. I know my father used to love to dance with her at various functions, and my mother was very, very fond of her, but as George says, we really did not see that much of her. I wonder if her grandchildren might not be willing to comment on what they recall.
Well, I'm Tom Loftus. I'm her grandson, and she was a fine babysitter. When I was growing up, many a night at Hickory Hill, listening to Gunsmoke and William Conrad, and my brother and I were in very capable hands with her. She was shy and introverted, and she was not I don't know, not always an enthusiastic public figure, but she did get involved in a lot of public activities around Washington, the Visiting Nurse Society, Humane Society, and she fulfilled a public role as well as a private one that I think she cherished. She was a rural, had a rural background like Grandpa himself, and I seem to remember an anecdote my mother told about them meeting. I believe that she was the sister of a good friend that Grandpa developed in his year at Albany Law School. She was working up there, and apparently at one point, before they knew each other much, she was out probably on a beautiful day like this, sitting on the park bench having lunch. My grandfather walked by, and there was, at that time, of course, there would be squirrels running about after the acorns. It might have been this time of year. And a popular name at that time for a squirrel would be Bobby. So she called for Bobby. Come over here, Bobby. And
Other questions, sir?
How many women have been clerks in the Supreme Court?
I'm not sure. Barrett, you may be able to quantify that. How many women have been law clerks? There were 0 women who were Jackson law clerks. The 11 were all men. There had been a token woman clerk or 2 during the time Jackson was on the court. But it's a much more modern development. Today, I would guess it's virtually 50-50. Do you have anybody have anything to add? Okay. And of course, none of the justices were women. Other questions?
John, just one question, and this may be a wrap-up question for the
Yes.
clerk. When they were there, did they observe who was perhaps the most dominant personality on the court, aside from Justice Jackson, but I'm putting him in that spot? I'd be curious to know who among the justices were the most dominant personality.
I think you all heard Greg's question. Other than Jackson, who they of course knew best and loved most, who was the dominant personality of the court, or what comments do they have about other personalities who were on the court at the time they were law clerks? I should add, I didn't mention this in the introduction, Barrett Prettyman actually clerked for 3 justices. So he has direct experience beyond Jackson. When Jackson died suddenly at the beginning of what was Barrett's 2nd year as a law clerk, he went to work in the chambers of Justice Frankfurter, and then when Justice Harlan was confirmed as Jackson's successor, Barrett was one of Harlan's initial law clerks. But the personalities of the justices.
I can't help but note first that Barrett evidently had trouble holding a job there. My own view would be that Felix Frankfurter would come right after the boss, as we called him, and Hugo Black and William O. Nicholas. It's interesting, if you mean by personality, someone removed from the influence they had on the other justice in the opinions and cases, but rather simply personality alone, why you would have to name Frankfurter and Black, and when he came on, probably Earl Warren. Certainly not, I think, Clark, Minton, or Burton. And Douglas was considered somewhat abrasive, difficult to get along with, even with his own law clerks. And therefore, although a very strong and independent Westerner, would not have been considered a dominant personality on the court. If you're talking about leadership in the sense of, as Justice Brennan used to remind everybody, all you needed on the Supreme Court was to be able to count to 5. And if you're talking about somebody who could gather 4 other votes to approve a decision, I haven't seen the statistics, but I would certainly think that Black would have to be pretty near the top of that group outside of Jackson.
I may take the prerogative of just following up. Justice Frankfurter was Justice Jackson's closest friend among the fellow justices, and Frankfurter was a regular visitor to the Jackson chambers through the clerk's office where these gentlemen worked. And so they all got a regular dose of Felix Frankfurter, who of course had been a professor and I think always had that temperament and approach. I'm wondering if we could do one round of recollections on him, a figure who may be more known historically and appreciated by you than he sadly is today. Felix Frankfurter.
Justice Frankfurter had no children, and therefore his wife and the court were his life, and he included in the court all the law clerks, and he would come into my office regularly, both to attempt to proselytize me about what Justice Jackson was thinking. And he loved us all. And when I clerked for him, he would have the law clerks over to his home in Georgetown quite regularly. He had a prodigious memory. He wrote to leaders throughout the world. He, like Jackson, as noted this morning, could go in dictating an opinion to you, desperately trying to get it all down. He could go to the wall and pick a book down, open it to a particular page, precisely the case he was looking for, and read from it, put it back. He was a lovely extrovert, interested in everything and everybody.
Through the way that Barrett described, I too came to know Justice Frankfurter very well because we saw quite a good deal. I admired him, and I think that I'd like to think that I learned some things from him as well as Justice Jackson. One of the things that I've thought over the years about the relationship between Robert H. Jackson and Felix Frankfurter was that Felix tended to be intolerant of incompetence. And it struck me that the L between Frankfurter and Jackson was great. The Harvard professor on the one hand and the country lawyer on the other. And they got along famously.
I can only add, everything that you said about Frankfurt is true. I think the important fact is that he had an extremely high opinion of Justice Jackson.
Thank you, one and all, for this opportunity to Q&A these wonderful personalities. One piece of just housekeeping for tonight. If I could have your attention for just a second. Procedurally, we are your program tonight. Through last year, just a little background, Ambassador Dupree was having a similar event here that we were having next door. We had a chance to chat between the events and said, gee, we'd like to know what's going on over there. So we thought it would be just a wonderful opportunity for our group, and you'll see a number of folks coming in from the area. To combine with your group, there will be the buffet dinner, which just like tonight, or just like today and last night. But then afterwards, stay in your seats because then the program, which will be our program honoring the clerks, will occur, and there'll be a unique speech by Barrett Prettyman, who gave you a little bit of a teaser earlier today, though he didn't disclose much beyond that. So, thank you, and we'll see you later tonight. Hey, handle that well.
Yeah, gotta earn my keep.